Okay, good evening or whatever time it may happen to be when you're looking at this. I just had to click something off of the screen there. I'm Bob Slater, and I'm going to try to present as balanced a picture regarding Jewish settlement in what was Palestine, or some people claim still is Palestine. Let's go back to or start with the proposition that this was the result of a colonial enterprise. There are lots of historical examples of colonial enterprise. In fact, that was the nature of the entire world for many centuries. The British Empire, French Empire, Spanish Empire, all well known. Dutch and the Germans also had colonies overseas, as well as other countries as well. Russia did not colonize areas overseas. They had a different approach where they conquered areas adjacent to them, and one could claim those as colonies, but usually Russia's sort of left out of the discussion. So, how does Israel become accused of being a colonial nation? There was no Israel at the time the colonization or settlement of Jews in that land took place. So a country that doesn't exist is kind of hard to accuse of being a colonial power. Also, the military strength of the early Jewish settlers paled by comparison of the Ottoman Empire, which was the ruling authority there for many centuries. So people turn to Britain as the culprit, since it's kind of hard to blame a country that doesn't exist. But let's look at Britain's role in the development and establishment of Israel. To understand it, you really have to go back to World War I and study that in detail. If it were not for World War I, there would almost certainly not be a Jewish Israel. There probably would be a Jewish settlement in a Muslim country ruled by the Ottoman Empire, living as a minority among majority Arabs and people who identify with the land there. They likely would not have called themselves Palestinians in that event. The identities were more tribal and local as opposed to global. But in any case, World War I occurs, and on the one side was Britain, France, and Russia primarily, and on the other side was Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. And this is key because as World War I progressed, the British attacked the Ottoman Empire as an ally of Germany as part of the war. And they managed to conquer large parts of the Ottoman Empire, including the Arabian Peninsula, what is now Israel / Palestine, and up into Syria and Lebanon and Iraq even. After the war was over, the question was, what do you do with those lands? And Britain did not have too strong an interest in establishing themselves in what was then Palestine, but they had a strong interest in keeping France out. Kind of forget that France and England had fought many wars between the two of them over the centuries. And just as soon as they were done working together to defeat the Germans, they began looking with suspicion upon the other and wanting to not let the other get too much power. So Britain's major concern was actually keeping France out, and had nothing to do with Jews, nothing to do with Muslims, actually. This was the nature of real politics in those days. Native uh, people or inhabitants of areas were not of concern as opposed to the balance of world power. So, how did England get control of it? Through negotiations. And there was a meeting of the League of Nations, which was a precursor to the UN, which granted Britain temporary control over the area until it could be established independently. And part of that charter included establishing a homeland for Jews. The rule of anti Semitism worldwide was pretty well recognized at that time, and many Europeans, especially, felt that having a home for them was a reasonable thing to do. Now, whether this went as far as having their own independent country is another matter. But nonetheless, this is how it started, as a charter to England to rule over the area temporarily and to establish a homeland for Jews as part of it. That does not fit the description of a colonial enterprise, almost by anybody's definition. Um, there, was some business deals going on, but this was not to be a huge investment uh, return for Britain, the way colonization is usually looked upon. And they did not send a bunch of British citizens there to colonize the place. And the Jews that came there were from many, many different countries, hardly a single country. So that the definition of Israel arising because of colonization is a very, very hard argument to make. And it's so hard, in fact, that a lot of people today have given up uh, using the term colonization. They've come up with a new term called settler colonization. And since it's kind of a new term, you can define that as you want. And in their view, Jews came uninvited by the local inhabitants and established their country over their resistance. And there is an element of truth to that, that a lot of people on the Israel Jewish side will not admit. But there's also a lot of falsehood to it. You'll find if you study almost anything, it's always more nuanced than either side will present. That the Jewish side, at least a major part of it, will present it as no fault on the part of Jews and 100% fault on the part of Arabs and Muslims. And the Arab side will present the opposite, that it's 100% the fault of the Jews, when in fact it's a very complex situation, having a lot to do with neither group, but world events outside that local area. So let's talk about settler colonization. One, the settlers that came there knew they were setting up in a new place, and many of them called themselves colonists, in fact, but they did not look upon it as a hostile thing. Most of them thought that they could share a land because there was plenty of room in the land for more people. It was sparsely populated, not populated, but sparsely populated at the time. And they thought they could live together, not only happily with the Arabs, but very happily because they would be bringing some modernization to the area that was needed. However, they didn't really ask the local people whether they wanted that or not. That was an assumption. There were some more knowledgeable people in the Jewish community that realized that the Arab Muslim population will not welcome Jews under any circumstance, and that it was going to be a struggle, if not from the get-go, eventually. And of course, they were later proven right. So how did the settlers get land there? Okay, the story that's told by the Arab side and those sympathetic is that they stole the land from the Arabs. Well, you have to look at this realistically. Britain was in control. Arabs owned the land. There is no way that Jews could have invaded and taken over land from a more powerful nation, England, or at least under their nose, or a more powerful population, since the Arab population was in the majority. The fact of the matter is that every bit of land that Jews settled on was purchased. Now, we're not talking about after or during the war that occurred after Israel declared itself a nation. We're talking about everything up to that point. Jews had to buy land. Now, how did that work? Well, it's very simple. The Arab landlords, which included a bunch of Ottomans in Turkey and a bunch of wealthy Arabs in Lebanon and Syria, and some who were pretty well-to-do living in what is referred to as Palestine. These wealthy owners have owned the land for a long time. They charged such high rents for the land that they kept the farmers relatively poor, but they were low enough to keep them happy. And all of a sudden, these people from overseas, mostly from various countries in Europe, but also some from South America and some even from Africa, come and they offer 10 times what the land is worth. I don't know if that 10 times is accurate, but literally much more would be a better way to put it. And the land was sold out from under the tenant farmers. Of course, they didn't really have a say because they did not own the land. They were renting it. So the land was purchased with money that came pouring in to support the idea of a Jewish homeland. But in any case, the land was legally bought. It would have been impossible for land to be stolen while the British were under control, because whatever you think about the British, they are a laws type people, and they don't put up with anything being stolen. But on the other hand, when the upset farmers who may have lived there for generations ran to the British saying, the Jews are stealing my land, there was nothing the British could do because the land had been legally transferred. One of the statements that Palestinians themselves made against the landowners, and was probably true, was that many of these landowners spent the days campaigning against Jewish purchases of land, and at night sold their land to them. And I think that is pretty accurate, that they weren't looking at the benefit of their countrymen. They saw a chance to make a huge profit selling the land for much more than it was worth. From the Jewish perspective, the land was worth a lot more because they were going to introduce more modern means of farming, use the land for more modern buildings and architecture and industry and so on. So they were willing to pay much more. And they did. They purchased the land. So this does not fit. Well, I guess you can force anything. You can say that's what settler colonialism is. But if you say that's what settler colonialism is, then just about every nation in the world is a settler colonial nation. Certainly the United States is, Canada is, all of South America is. Uh, these were people who came uninvited and took over. And even if Europe, England at one point had uh, people trying to remember the name now that the original inhabitants there were invaded by people from France, Normandy, who took over, and the Anglo Saxons were blended with the Normans. There was tremendous upheaval all over Europe and land changing hands back and forth many times. Um, and I don't know whether what kind of colonialism you want to call that. And in fact, if you go back to the original Arab conquest, the Muslim conquest of the land, and we're going back now to somewhere around the 5th century, I believe. Could look it up to be sure. The Muslim armies spread north and attacked areas and settled them. Israel, the land of Israel, was not inherently Muslim. It was a Jewish land. Jews were exiled from their own land by the Babylonians and later allowed to return and then exiled again by the Romans. However, they never exiled 100% of the population. There was always at least some significant residual left. But the time when the Muslim invasion occurred, it was a part of the Byzantine Empire, which means it was a Christian nation primarily, with a Jewish minority. And the two of them fought against the Muslims, but were defeated. Well, they capitulated. They realized that they were going to lose badly, is what happened, and they capitulated. So, what kind of settler is that? What kind of colonization is that when an Islamic army comes in and defeats the Christian and Jewish population and takes over and populates the place and converts the people with the persuasion of the sword to become Muslim? So the whole world could be accused of settler colonialism. But you can still you could sort of make that as an argument. It's a weak one, but you can make it. But you have to deal with the fact that the whole world is probably a settler colonial enterprise. Um, so where do you go from there? Well, it's the subject of another talk. But are there two sides to the issue? If you can't see two sides, I think you're blind. The Jewish side says this is land which is historically ours, going back to biblical times. We did not leave the land voluntarily. We never gave up our right to return to the land. And we had the opportunity to come back and take over the land peacefully by purchasing the land and settling the land. And that would be the view that they would present. The Arabs, on the other hand, living in the area, say, look, these landowners had no right to be selling the land to people from outside. They were violating my rights as a Muslim, as an Arab, or as a Christian Arab, if they happened to be such at the time. And you have to be sympathetic with that. I mean, you think if you were a member of a family and your family had been farming that land for 400 years, maybe, for generation after generation after generation, and then all of a sudden one day somebody comes by and tells you the farm's been sold, you can't live here anymore. Uh, Most likely you would take your anger out of the people coming in as opposed to the people settling, because that's human nature. No different than when immigrants came to the United States. People blamed the immigrants, not the landlords that rented to them or sold to them. So I see a story with two sides. There are possible resolutions. We can discuss those later. But I think the idea that Israel is a colonial nation is it's absurd by all the meanings of colonialism. If you want to make up a new term and call it settler colonialism, you can do that, but that doesn't make it distinct from virtually every nation in the world where populations came and replaced other populations, and usually by violent means. Sometimes just by taking over the land and increasing in numbers. Um, Any case, please feel free to share this with anyone you want. My major target audience are really young Jews who are brought up with the attitude that there's only one side to this issue, that there is no Arab side, and to Arabs who also feel that there's no nuance involved here. It was sheer uh, conspiracy and theft. Uh, it's none of those things purely, and all of those things impurely. The question is how we're going to live with this in the future, and that will be a subject maybe for a future talk. Let's say good night to anybody. It's night for me now. Please share this if you are inclined to do that. If you have questions or comments you want to address to me, put them on Facebook, and I will do my best to answer them. Um, Anything which is profane will be ignored. Anything which is highly biased will be treated with respect, because it's by nature. I can understand people who are highly biased on both sides. But I disagree with the extreme views on both sides, and hope and pray that we find a peaceful way to mediate the land dispute which has been going on in that area uh, since before the time of Moses. Good night, all.